He was a powerful CEO feared in boardrooms across New York, but in his own home, his children flinched at the sound of his footsteps. They never laughed out loud. They never played without permission, and every nanny who had ever stepped into that mansion was gone within weeks. Until one young woman, struggling to survive the city's cruel reality, knocked on the gate one rainy morning and stepped into a silence heavier than grief. She came for a job. But what she found behind those tall black gates was a house haunted not by ghosts, but by sorrow. The man who hired her gave one rule: don't get close to my children. But what happens when broken hearts start to heal? When the smallest child clings to you in the dark and whispers, "Please don't leave, stay with us." Because what started as a job offer will turn into a battle for love, trust, and the soul of a shattered family. What secret is the cold-hearted billionaire hiding? And can one ordinary woman teach 3 children and their father how to feel again? The Nanny Who Stayed. Rain soaked the gray streets of Manhattan as Isabella Torres tightened her thin, thrift store jacket, her breath fogging in the chilly air. She had walked for hours, soaked to the skin, and her worn sneakers squelched with every desperate step. Her stomach had been empty for 2 days, a gnawing ache that mirrored the emptiness in her heart. Hope, once a flickering candle, was now barely a shadow. No one wanted to hire a college dropout with no experience. The mounting debt from her mother's illness had forced her to leave school, and definitely not someone who looked like she'd slept in the subway, which she had, the night before. Just when she was about to give up, collapsing onto a bus stop bench, her eyes landed on a flyer taped to the glass, slightly peeling from the dampness. Live-in nanny wanted. High pay. No experience needed. Immediate start. It seemed too good to be true, a lifeline tossed into her personal storm. No name, no company, just a phone number and an Upper East Side address, an address in a world that felt impossibly far from her own. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out her basic flip phone and sent a hesitant text message to the number. "Hi, this is Isabella. I saw your ad. I'm interested in the nanny job." A reply came instantly, blunt and devoid of pleasantries. "Be there tomorrow morning at 9. Don't be late." The next morning, Isabella stood in front of a towering limestone mansion, nestled behind ivy-covered black gates, feeling like a trespasser in a world that would never be hers. The sheer scale of the place was intimidating, a symbol of wealth and power beyond her comprehension. The security camera above the gate blinked once, its red eye a silent observer. Then, a voice crackled through the intercom, crisp and disembodied. "Name, Isabella Torres. I'm here for the nanny position." The gate buzzed, a low, heavy sound, and swung open. Inside, the estate was silent. Not the peaceful silence of a quiet morning, but the kind of silence that screamed money and something else, something she couldn't quite place, something heavy, waiting in the air. A tall woman in a black uniform met her at the entrance, her face kind but serious. "Mr. Sterling is expecting you. Follow me." Mr. Julian Sterling, billionaire CEO of a major tech conglomerate, sat at the head of a long, gleaming glass dining table, dressed sharply in a dark button-up shirt and tailored slacks. He didn't smile when he looked at her. His blue eyes, penetrating and unreadable, assessed her with a cold, clinical gaze that made her feel like she was being dissected. His voice was calm, almost too calm, an unnerving lack of warmth. "You have experience with children?" he asked, his tone purely factual. "Not professionally," Isabella replied, her voice surprisingly steady despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. "But I helped raise my younger siblings." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes giving nothing away. Then he said something that sent a chill down her spine, a glimpse into the hidden reality of this house. "The last 3 nannies didn't last a week." Isabella blinked, surprised by his bluntness. "Why?" His jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. "They weren't the right fit. My children require structure, discipline, and absolute silence when needed." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "Can you provide that?" She nodded, unsure what absolute silence when needed truly meant in the context of young children, but desperate for the job. "Yes, sir. You'll live here, Room and board included, he continued, laying out the terms. You'll follow the schedule. No personal calls in the house. No guests. Understood. Yes, sir. That night, alone in her assigned room, a suite far too luxurious for someone who had been sleeping in a subway station just 2 nights ago, Isabella stared at the ornate ceiling. She couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't just accepted a job. She had stepped into something much larger, something darker, a world bound by unspoken rules and a heavy, pervasive silence. Part 2. The Secret and the Discovery. The next morning, Isabella met the children. There were 3 of them, silent figures in a silent house. Matteo, age 6, serious beyond his years, his eyes holding a depth that spoke of things he didn't articulate. Sophia, age 4, who never made eye contact, her small body tense. And Leo, only 2, who clutched a frayed comfort blanket so tightly his knuckles were white. None of them spoke when she was introduced. They simply looked at her with wide, guarded eyes, assessing the new stranger in their midst. Breakfast was served in a formal, echoing dining room, presided over by Julian Sterling at the head of the long glass table. The children sat rigidly in their seats, small, stiff figures in a vast space, chewing slowly, never glancing at their father. The silence was broken only by the faint clinking of silverware and the controlled movements of Mrs. Rodriguez, the head housekeeper, and the staff. Isabella tried to make conversation, offering hesitant questions about their favorite colors or what they learned in school. But each word felt like it fractured the heavy atmosphere, disrupting a fragile, invisible order. When Leo accidentally dropped his spoon, sending a small clatter across the table, Matteo instantly picked it up, his small hands trembling slightly as he carefully placed it back on his brother's tray. Julian didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge the dropped spoon or Matteo's nervous reaction. He simply continued eating, detached, seemingly unaware. Isabella watched, her heart twisting. These weren't just quiet kids. These were kids who had learned fear. Kids who had learned that silence, control, and not making mistakes were paramount. Later that day, while playing blocks with Leo on the carpet in the playroom, a vast space filled with expensive, untouched toys, she whispered softly, trying to entice him. Do you like colors, Leo? Should we build a red tower? Or a blue one? Leo didn't reply with words, but for the first time, his lips curled slightly into a tentative, fleeting smile as he reached for a bright yellow block. Progress. A tiny crack in the wall, until she heard the footsteps behind her. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Miss Cole, Isabella. Alexander Julian's voice was calm, but there was a hard, unyielding edge in it that cut through the fragile moment. He stood in the doorway, observing them. This isn't playtime. You are here to keep them on schedule, to maintain structure. Isabella stood up, her own resolve hardening, a sudden protectiveness for the quiet children rising within her. They're children, Mr. Sterling. They need to play, to laugh. You are not here to parent, he stated, his voice cold, absolute. You are here to ensure they are safe, that the schedule is followed, that there are no distractions. Safe from what? She asked before she could stop herself, the question echoing the one she'd had since she stepped into the mansion's silent gates. A pause. Julian's eyes were unreadable, his face a mask of controlled emotion. That's not your concern, Miss Cole, Isabella. That night, alone in her luxurious room, far from the cracked ceiling and cold water she was used to, she dreamed of doors that wouldn't open, of children crying silently behind high, invisible walls. When she woke, her hands were clenched into fists, a fierce determination settling within her. She knew one thing with absolute certainty. These children were not okay, and neither was this house. But she wasn't leaving. Not yet. She had stumbled into their silent world, and she wouldn't abandon them to it. Part 3. The Unexpected Reaction. 3 days stretched into a week, and Isabella still couldn't believe she hadn't been fired. Each morning, she arrived at the Sterling mansion bracing herself for the inevitable summons to Alexander's study, for the cold, final dismissal. But it never came. Instead, the mansion's routine continued. A strange, tense dance around the edges of the secret that had been revealed. For precaution, Isabella had arranged for a neighbor to watch Leo temporarily, a costly solution that ate into her meager savings, but necessary. While cleaning the large living room windows, she found herself glancing frequently at Alexander, working silently on his laptop, a figure of cold, unwavering focus. "Carmen tells me you're having trouble with your babysitter." Alexander's voice, abrupt and unexpected, broke the silence, startling her. Isabella almost dropped the cloth she was holding. She hadn't expected him to address her directly about it, especially after everything. "Yes, Mr. Sterling," she replied, her voice quiet, surprised he even cared. "I'm looking for someone permanent, but it's difficult to find someone reliable, who charges what I can afford." Alexander nodded without looking at her, seemingly engrossed in his computer screen. "If you need to bring him someday," he said finally, his voice flat factual, "you can use the room next to the laundry. It has better ventilation than the storage closet." Isabella almost dropped the cloth again. Was he giving her permission to bring Leo to the mansion? The man who demanded absolute order, who couldn't tolerate distractions. Are you sure, Mr. Sterling?" she dared to ask, confusion overriding her fear. Alexander frowned slightly, as if he hadn't intended to say it, as if the words had escaped him. "As long as it doesn't interfere with your work, Isabella." He stood abruptly and left the room without another word, but Mariana noticed the way his hands were clenched into fists, as if he were physically restraining himself, fighting against the decision he had just made. 3 days later, the temporary solution fell through. The neighbor's daughter, whom she relied on, had fallen ill. Isabella felt the familiar weight of desperation settle onto her shoulders. Her salary barely covered basic expenses, and finding a new, affordable, trustworthy babysitter on short notice felt impossible. During her break, she frantically called everyone she knew, her voice growing weary with each failed attempt. "Everyone charges too much," she whispered to herself, tired and defeated. Finally, with no alternatives, Isabella had to bring Leo back to the mansion. This time, however, she installed him in the small, better ventilated room Alexander had suggested. Leo was unusually quiet that day, as if he sensed the precariousness of his mother's situation. As the day progressed, Isabella noticed subtle changes. Alexander didn't snap at her when she accidentally left a cleaning supply out of place. He seemed less intensely focused on rigid order. And then, she found the first gift, a small, plush teddy bear, sitting on the table in the room where Leo was. There was no note, but she knew it had come from him. A few days later, a new, state-of-the-art baby monitor appeared, followed by a set of high-quality baby clothes. These weren't expensive gifts meant to impress. They were practical, thoughtful items, left anonymously. "The master is changing," Mrs. Rodriguez commented to Isabella one morning as they prepared lunch, her voice low, filled with a mixture of awe and worry. "I've never seen him take such an interest in anyone, let alone a child." Isabella didn't respond, but she felt a complex mix of gratitude and confusion. The severe, distant man who had hired her seemed to be slowly transforming, at least when Leo was present. The Ice King was showing unexpected signs of softening. Part 4. Cautious Permission and Subtle Changes. 3 days stretched into a week, and Isabella still couldn't believe she hadn't been fired. Each morning, she arrived at the Sterling mansion bracing herself for the inevitable summons to Alexander's study, for the cold, final dismissal. But it never came. Instead, the mansion's routine continued, a strange, tense dance around the edges of the secret that had been revealed. For precaution, Isabella had arranged for a neighbor to watch Leo temporarily, a costly solution that ate into her meager savings, but necessary. While cleaning the large living room windows, she found herself glancing frequently at Alexander, working silently on his laptop, a figure of cold, unwavering focus. "Carmen tells me you're having trouble with your babysitter." Alexander's voice, abrupt and unexpected, broke the silence, startling her. Isabella almost dropped the cloth she was holding. She hadn't expected him to address her directly about it, especially after Everything. Yes, Mr. Sterling, she replied, her voice quiet, surprised he even cared. I'm looking for someone permanent, but it's difficult to find someone reliable, who charges what I can afford. Alexander nodded without looking at her, seemingly engrossed in his computer screen. If you need to bring him someday, he said finally, his voice flat factual, you can use the room next to the laundry. It has better ventilation than the storage closet. Isabella almost dropped the cloth again. Was he giving her permission to bring Leo to the mansion? The man who demanded absolute order, who couldn't tolerate distractions. Are you sure, Mr. Sterling? She dared to ask, confusion overriding her fear. Alexander frowned slightly, as if he hadn't intended to say it, as if the words had escaped him. As long as it doesn't interfere with your work, Isabella. He stood abruptly and left the room without another word. But Mariana noticed the way his hands were clenched into fists, as if he were physically restraining himself, fighting against the decision he had just made. 3 days later, the temporary solution fell through. The neighbor's daughter, whom she relied on, had fallen ill. Isabella felt the familiar weight of desperation settle onto her shoulders. Her salary barely covered basic expenses, and finding a new, affordable, trustworthy babysitter on short notice felt impossible. During her break, she frantically called everyone she knew, her voice growing weary with each failed attempt. Everyone charges too much, she whispered to herself, tired and defeated. Finally, with no alternatives, Isabella had to bring Leo back to the mansion. This time, however, she installed him in the small, better ventilated room Alexander had suggested. Leo was unusually quiet that day, as if he sensed the precariousness of his mother's situation. As the day progressed, Isabella noticed subtle changes. Alexander didn't snap at her when she accidentally left a cleaning supply out of place. He seemed less intensely focused on rigid order. And then, she found the first gift. A small, plush teddy bear, sitting on the table in the room where Leo was. There was no note, but she knew it had come from him. A few days later, a new, state-of-the-art baby monitor appeared, followed by a set of high-quality baby clothes. These weren't expensive gifts meant to impress. They were practical, thoughtful items, left anonymously. The master is changing, Mrs. Rodriguez commented to Isabella one morning as they prepared lunch, her voice low, filled with a mixture of awe and worry. I've never seen him take such an interest in anyone, let alone a child. Isabella didn't respond, but she felt a complex mix of gratitude and confusion. The severe, distant man who had hired her seemed to be slowly transforming, at least when Leo was present. The Ice King was showing unexpected signs of softening. Part 5, The Bond begins. Isabella continued to bring Leo to the mansion occasionally, navigating the subtle shift in atmosphere and the unspoken awareness that now permeated the Sterling mansion. Alexander seemed increasingly comfortable with the baby's presence, his earlier resistance replaced by a quiet, almost watchful interest. One afternoon, as Isabella was tidying up the study, she heard the faint sound of crying. She glanced at the baby monitor. Alexander had left. Leo was awake and upset in the service quarters room. She moved quickly towards the door, but paused. The crying seemed to be subsiding. She stopped in the hallway, just outside the slightly ajar door to the room, and stood frozen. Alexander was inside, holding Leo. The baby, who usually cried when held by strangers, was perfectly comfortable in his arms, his small hands gripping Alexander's tie. Alexander was talking to him in a low, gentle voice, a sound Isabella had never heard him use before. Quiet now, little one, Alexander murmured, swaying gently. Mommy's busy working, but she'll be here soon. Isabella's breath hitched. There was something profoundly moving about seeing this powerful, often cold man holding her son with such surprising naturalness and tenderness. Excuse me, Mr. Sterling, she said finally, stepping into the room, feeling a flush of embarrassment for interrupting, for witnessing this private moment. I lost track of time. Alexander turned, but didn't seem embarrassed or uncomfortable. He was crying. The monitor that you left worked. He said it matter-of-factly, as if comforting a baby in the service quarters was a normal part of his day. You can finish what you were doing. I'll stay with him for a moment. It's not necessary, Isabella insisted gently. I can take him. I insist, he interrupted, his voice firm but without its usual hardness. Isabella hesitated, then nodded, a complex mix of surprise, gratitude, and a dawning sense of wonder swirling within her. She returned to the study, but her focus was broken, her mind replaying the image of Alexander holding Leo. From the hallway, Mrs. Rodriguez watched the scene with a mix of awe and deep worry. When Isabella passed by later, Mrs. Rodriguez stopped her, taking her arm. Be careful, child, she whispered, her voice low, concerned. If he gets too attached, it could hurt you both. And the child. What do you mean? Isabella asked, confused by the warning. Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head, her gaze distant, filled with a sorrow Isabella didn't understand. There are wounds in this house, child. Wounds that have never healed. She wouldn't say more. That night, when Isabella finally finished her work and went to pick up Leo from the service quarters room to take him home, she found Alexander still there, sitting on the small sofa, holding the baby, who was now asleep on his chest. The image struck her speechless. He has your eyes, Alexander commented quietly, looking down at the sleeping baby, then up at Isabella. And your smile. Thank you for watching him, she responded softly, approaching to take her son. Alexander carefully handed Leo to her, their hands brushing briefly during the exchange. A strange silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken things, with the shared vulnerability of the moment. I don't know why it affects me so much to see him, Alexander murmured suddenly, almost to himself, but loud enough for her to hear, his gaze distant. Isabella held Leo closer, waiting, sensing there was something more, something he needed to say. Alexander took a deep breath before continuing, the words coming out hesitantly, raw with pain he had kept hidden for years. My wife and I, we had a son. His voice was thick with emotion, the carefully constructed facade crumbling. He was born premature. He only survived for a few hours. Mariana felt her heart clench, the sudden revelation bringing a wave of profound sadness. The coldness, the rigid control, the avoidance of personal connection. It all clicked into place, a shield against unimaginable pain. I'm so sorry, Mr. Sterling, she murmured, tears stinging her eyes, not knowing what else to say. She couldn't get over it, he continued, as if needing to finally voice the words he had held captive for so long. She blamed me for working so much during the pregnancy, for not being there when the complications started. Maybe she was right. He paused, his gaze distant, lost in the painful memory. A month after the funeral, she asked for a divorce. Isabella held Leo tighter, feeling an immense wave of gratitude for the healthy, sleeping child in her arms, for the life she had, difficult as it was. Not everyone can face a loss like that, she said softly, her voice filled with compassion. But you're still here. Alexander looked at her then, really looked at her, seeing perhaps not just his employee, but a woman who understood loss, who embodied resilience. Sometimes I wonder if I'm still here, he responded with an honesty that surprised them both. Or if I'm just pretending to be. Good night, Mr. Sterling, Isabella said, the quiet acknowledgement of his pain hanging in the air between them. As she walked towards the bus stop with Leo asleep in her arms, Isabella couldn't stop thinking about Alexander's confession. Suddenly, so many things made sense, his coldness, his obsession with control, his initial rejection of Leo's presence, and now his growing, hesitant interest in the baby. For the first time, she saw Alexander Sterling not just as the intimidating boss, but as a man who had lost more than anyone should ever have to bear. A man whose heart was not absent, but deeply, profoundly wounded. Part 6. Sharing Truths. Isabella held Leo closer, feeling an immense wave of gratitude for the healthy, sleeping child in her arms, for the life she had, difficult as it was. Not everyone can face a loss like that, she said softly, her voice filled with compassion. But, you're still here. She looked at Alexander, really looked at him, seeing perhaps not just his employee, but a man who understood loss, who embodied resilience. Sometimes I wonder if I'm still here, he responded with an honesty that surprised them both. Or if I'm just pretending to be. Good night, Mr. Sterling, Isabella said, the quiet acknowledgement of his pain hanging in the air between them. As she walked towards the bus stop with Leo asleep in her arms, Isabella couldn't stop thinking about Alexander's confession. Suddenly, so many things made sense: his coldness, his obsession with control, his initial rejection of Leo's presence, and now his growing, hesitant interest in the baby. For the first time, she saw Alexander Sterling not just as the intimidating boss, but as a man who had lost more than anyone should ever have to bear. A man whose heart was not absent, but deeply, profoundly wounded. Part 7: Growing Connection and Breaking Walls. The weeks that followed brought a notable, subtle shift in the Sterling mansion. What was once a place dominated by cold order and silence began to fill, occasionally, with the sounds of Leo's laughter and, sometimes, with the quiet, almost shy smile of Alexander. Isabella had finally found a reliable babysitter. But, interestingly, Alexander found reasons for her to bring Leo to the mansion at least twice a week. So he doesn't miss the environment, he would say. A transparent excuse that made Isabella smile inwardly. Or the babysitter might need a break. Transparent excuses that Isabella accepted without question, because she saw how her son's presence was slowly transforming the atmosphere of that grand, lonely house. Alexander seemed increasingly comfortable with Leo. The man who had once struggled to hold a baby now carried him with surprising ease, learning to change diapers, with a little help from Mrs. Rodriguez, who watched his transformation with a mixture of wonder and continued worry, and reading him bedtime stories. His interactions with Isabella grew warmer, less formal. They talked more, sharing observations about Leo's development, discussing her part-time work at the shelter, even sometimes touching on lighter, personal topics. One Sunday afternoon, Alexander surprised them by asking Isabella to stay a few extra hours. It was unusual for him to need her on a weekend, but he insisted it was for a special project. When she arrived with Leo, Alexander was waiting in the back garden. "What is all this?" Isabella asked, amazed, surveying the scene. A small inflatable pool sat on the lawn, filled with water, surrounded by colorful baby toys scattered across the grass. "It's hot," Alexander replied simply, with a naturalness that still surprised her. "Thought the little one might like to cool off." Leo, who was now 8 months old and starting to crawl with determined energy, spotted the colorful spectacle and immediately squealed with delight, making a beeline for the pool. Isabella couldn't help but smile at the unexpected gesture, the thoughtfulness behind it. "You didn't have to bother, Mr. Sterling." "Alexander," he corrected gently, meeting her gaze. "When we're not working, I'd prefer you called me Alexander." The afternoon unfolded as if it belonged to a different reality. One where Isabella wasn't his employee and Alexander wasn't the severe businessman. They were simply two adults, enjoying the infectious joy of a baby splashing happily in the water. At one point, while Leo was happily playing with a rubber duck, Alexander sat beside Isabella in the shade of a large oak tree. "I think he likes being with me more than with you," he commented with a smile, a rare, playful expression that made Isabella's heart skip a beat. It was a side of him she had never imagined. She laughed, a warm sound, feeling a strange warmth spread in her chest. "That's because you don't have to tell him no when he gets into mischief." "I could learn," he responded, and there was something in his tone, a note of possibility, that made Isabella look at him intently. Their eyes met briefly, and for an instant, everything else seemed to vanish. The mansion, their different worlds, the past pain. A shiver ran down her spine. What was happening between them? Whatever it was, it felt dangerous, impossible, and yet increasingly difficult to ignore. The illusion of normalcy held for the rest of the afternoon, until the sun began to set. As they gathered up the toys from the garden, Leo began to yawn, tired from his energetic playtime. "I should take him home," Isabella said. It's been a big day for him. I can drive you, Alexander offered. It's late for you to take the bus with him. It's not necessary, really. I insist, he interrupted, his voice soft, gentle, but with an underlying firmness she now recognized. I wouldn't feel comfortable knowing you were traveling alone at this hour with Leo. The drive in Alexander's luxurious car was silent, but strangely comfortable. Leo fell asleep almost immediately, lulled by the gentle purr of the engine. When they arrived at Isabella's modest apartment building, she was suddenly acutely aware of the stark contrast between their worlds. A contrast made even more apparent by the luxury vehicle parked on her street. "Thank you for everything, Alexander," she said, gathering Leo and his things. It was a wonderful afternoon. Alexander watched her, his gaze intense, holding her eyes. "For me too," he admitted, his voice low. "More than you know." They said goodbye with a tacit promise of more afternoons like that. And so it was. Over the following weeks, the relationship between them transformed into something undefined, something more than employer and employee, less than friends, but charged with an underlying tension, an unspoken pull neither could ignore. One night, after Isabella had put Leo to bed in the room at the mansion that was now practically his, she found Alexander in the dimly lit hallway. Most of the staff had retired for the night, leaving them alone in the quiet mansion. "He looks more like you every day," Alexander commented, referring to Leo, his voice soft, breaking the silence. "Everyone says that," she replied with a small smile. "Though he has his father's stubbornness. It must be difficult," Alexander said, his voice gaining a more serious tone. "Raising him alone." Isabella nodded slightly. "It is, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." They looked at each other in silence, and something in the air shifted, thickened. Alexander took a step towards her, closing the distance between them. Isabella felt her heart accelerating, sensing what might be about to happen. He raised a hand, hesitating for an instant, before gently brushing his fingers against her cheek. Time seemed to stop. Alexander leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. But Isabella didn't move. Their lips met in a kiss, tentative, almost fearful at first, then quickly deepening, becoming more urgent, more profound. Years of loneliness, of guarded emotions, of unspoken attraction seemed to dissolve in that single contact. When they finally separated, both breathing heavily, Alexander rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, as if afraid to open them, afraid to break the spell. "Tell me this isn't a mistake," he whispered, his voice hoarse, raw with a vulnerability she had never imagined in him. Before Isabella could respond, a dry, sharp sound broke the intimacy. A door opening, a tray clattering. Mrs. Rodriguez stood at the end of the hallway, her eyes wide with shock, a tray fallen to the floor at her feet. The moment was shattered. But what had begun in that hallway could no longer be stopped. Part 8. The First Kiss and the Witness. One night, after Isabella had put Leo to bed in the room at the mansion that was now practically his, she found Alexander in the dimly lit hallway. Most of the staff had retired for the night, leaving them alone in the quiet mansion. "He looks more like you every day," Alexander commented, referring to Leo, his voice soft, breaking the silence. "Everyone says that," she replied with a small smile. "Though he has his father's stubbornness. It must be difficult," Alexander said, his voice gaining a more serious tone. "Raising him alone." Isabella nodded slightly. "It is, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." They looked at each other in silence, and something in the air shifted, thickened. Alexander took a step towards her, closing the distance between them. Isabella felt her heart accelerating, sensing what might be about to happen. He raised a hand, hesitating for an instant, before gently brushing his fingers against her cheek. Time seemed to stop. Alexander leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. But Isabella didn't move. Their lips met in a kiss, tentative, almost fearful at first, then quickly deepening, becoming more urgent, more profound. Years of loneliness, of guarded emotions, of unspoken attraction seemed to dissolve in that single contact. When they finally separated, both breathing heavily, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. His eyes closed, as if afraid to open them, afraid to break the spell. "Tell me this isn't a mistake," he whispered, his voice hoarse, raw with a vulnerability she had never imagined in him. Before Isabella could respond, a dry, sharp sound broke the intimacy. A door opening, a tray clattering. Mrs. Rodriguez stood at the end of the hallway, her eyes wide with shock, a tray fallen to the floor at her feet. The moment was shattered. But what had begun in that hallway could no longer be stopped. Part 9. A new reality and external pressure. The world in the Sterling mansion changed dramatically after that night. The kiss, witnessed by Mrs. Rodriguez, quickly became the subject of hushed whispers among the staff. While Mrs. Rodriguez herself was shocked, her concern for Isabella and Leo eventually led her to be subtly supportive, but the gossip among others was less kind. The line between employer and employee had been irrevocably blurred, and everyone knew it. The dynamic between Isabella and Alexander shifted from unspoken tension to a palpable, albeit still cautious, intimacy. They tried to maintain appearances in front of the staff, but the lingering looks, the hushed conversations in hallways when they thought they were alone, the easy way Leo now reached for Alexander. It was undeniable. The relationship became undeniable, but it was also subject to the intense scrutiny of their different worlds. Staff were curious, some supportive, others wary or even resentful. News of the CEO of Sterling Group developing an interest in his housekeeper and her child inevitably leaked beyond the mansion walls, becoming fodder for society whispers and eventually, tabloid speculation. Isabella was thrust into a spotlight she never wanted, facing judgment and rumors about her intentions. Alexander, the man who had always controlled his image, now found his personal life exposed. His choices questioned by his peers and even some members of his board. Despite the external pressure, Alexander made it clear through his actions that Isabella and Leo were no longer just temporary residents or responsibilities. They were family. He protected Isabella from gossip, ensuring she was treated with respect by the staff, and confronting any outside attempts to sensationalize their story. The relationship solidified rapidly. They spent more time together as a family unit, going out to parks, sharing meals, creating a bubble of normalcy amidst the external chaos. Isabella saw Alexander navigate the judgment with surprising resolve, prioritizing their happiness over public opinion or his company's image. "People will talk," Isabella had said one night, lying beside him in the grand bed, feeling overwhelmed by the scale of his world and the rumors swirling around them. "They'll say I'm with you for your money, or that you're just slumming." Alexander had silenced her with a kiss. "Let them talk," he had responded, his voice firm with an unshakable certainty. "What matters is here." He touched her heart, then his own. "What matters is us. What matters is Leo's happiness, and yours and mine." He laughed softly. "Who cares what they whisper?" What began as a secret had blossomed into a profound connection. And now Alexander, the man who had always valued control and reputation above all else, was willing to face down his entire world for the woman and child who had melted the ice around his heart. Part 10. Crisis, Isabella's illness. Life settled into a new, comfortable rhythm at the Sterling mansion. Isabella was no longer just the housekeeper. She was Alexander's partner, Leo's mother, a vibrant presence who had filled the grand house with warmth and life. Alexander was visibly transformed, happier, more relaxed, his focus shifting from relentless work to building their life together. But even in their newfound happiness, life had a way of throwing unexpected challenges their way. It started subtly, a wave of dizziness while Isabella was serving breakfast, a sudden, overwhelming fatigue that couldn't be explained by late nights with Leo. She attributed it to stress, to the immense changes in her life, to finally allowing herself to relax after years of constant struggle. One afternoon, while cleaning the vast library, the dizziness returned with a vengeance. Her vision blurred, the room spun, and the last thing she remembered before everything went black was the sound of heavy books tumbling to the floor. She woke to the sterile smell of a hospital room, the constant beeping of machines a jarring contrast to the quiet peace of the mansion. She tried to sit up, but a firm hand gently stopped her. "Easy, Isabella. Don't get up." Alexander's voice was close, tight with worry. "Leo?" she asked, her voice raspy, the first name that came to her dry lips. "He's fine. Mrs. Rodriguez is looking after him," he replied, his hand warm as he gently stroked hers. "Why didn't you tell me you weren't feeling well? I didn't think it was serious," she murmured, her mind hazy. The door opened, and a doctor entered, his expression grave after examining her charts. After a brief, technical explanation, he confirmed what they feared. Isabella had a severe infection that required immediate, aggressive treatment and hospitalization for several weeks. Several weeks. Panic flared in Isabella's eyes. "I can't. My son. Leo. I'll take care of him," Alexander intervened firmly, his voice leaving no room for debate. He was already stepping into the role, the man of action taking charge. "You just focus on getting better, Isabella." Isabella wanted to protest, to say she could manage, that Leo needed his mother, but the exhaustion of the infection and the shock of the diagnosis overwhelmed her. With tears streaming down her face, she could only nod weakly before drifting back into a restless, medicated sleep. The first few days were the hardest for Alexander. While the staff at the mansion were invaluable, taking care of the practicalities, the primary care of a 6-month-old baby fell to him. Changing diapers, preparing bottles, deciphering cries, rocking Leo back to sleep in the dead of night. It was a challenge utterly unlike anything he had ever faced in the corporate world. But with every sleepless night, with every successful feeding, with every moment Leo smiled up at him, the bond between father and son solidified. One morning, rocking Leo back to sleep, Alexander found himself humming an old lullaby his own mother used to sing. Leo looked up at him with his big, dark eyes, so like Isabella's, and for the first time in years, Alexander felt a sense of purpose, of belonging, that went far beyond the walls of his company. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. "We're going to take care of your mom, okay?" he whispered to the baby, who responded with a soft gurgle, a small, happy sound that felt like an affirmation. With each passing day, a quiet transformation occurred within the mansion. Rooms that were once dominated by cold precision now had colorful toys scattered across the floor. Alexander's study, the epitome of his detached focus, became an impromptu playroom. A small crib nestled beside his imposing desk so he could work while keeping an eye on Leo. "I never thought I'd see the master like this," Mrs. Rodriguez commented to the cook one morning, watching Alexander expertly prepare Leo's baby food. "He's like a different man." "Love changes people," the cook replied with a knowing smile. "And that child. He's managed to melt the ice that surrounded his heart." Alexander visited Isabella in the hospital every afternoon, bringing Leo with him, sharing updates on their son's progress. His first tentative attempts to crawl, new babbling sounds, the way he now responded to his name. During one visit, while Leo was happily playing with a toy on the hospital bed, Alexander showed Isabella a photo on his phone. It was of him and Leo, asleep together on the living room sofa at the mansion, a moment of quiet, shared vulnerability. "Mrs. Rodriguez took this yesterday," he explained with a shy smile. "Says we fell asleep like this after dinner." Isabella felt tears fill her eyes, but this time they were not of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude and love. Seeing her son so comfortable, so secure in Alexander's arms, witnessing the undeniable bond between them, it was a profound emotion, a validation of everything she had hoped for. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling, "for taking care of him, for everything." Alexander took her hand in his, gently stroking her fingers. "He's given me something I thought I would never have again," he confessed in a low voice, filled with a raw honesty that stole her breath. "A purpose beyond work, a reason to wake up with joy." They looked at each other in silence, the weight of unspoken emotions, of shared pain and burgeoning hope, hanging in the air between them. Alexander leaned in and gently kissed her forehead, a gesture so filled with tenderness that Isabella felt her heart might burst. When it was time to say goodbye, Alexander gathered Leo, who protested briefly at being separated from his mother. Before leaving the room, Alexander paused at the door and looked back at Isabella with an intensity that left her breathless. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," he whispered. And in those simple words was a promise that would transform both their lives forever. Watching them walk away, Alexander holding their son, Isabella realized that despite being in a hospital bed, temporarily separated from Leo, she had never felt less alone in her entire life. Part 11. Alexander steps up, full-time father. This section covers Alexander taking full-time care of Leo while Isabella is hospitalized, solidifying his paternal role and transformation. It was already covered within Part 10 in the previous turn. I will skip to the next distinct phase, which is Part 12, her discharge and moving into the mansion. Part 12, coming home, a new family. After 3 weeks in the hospital, the day of returning home finally arrived for Isabella. Sitting in the wheelchair the hospital policy required for discharge, she waited nervously, a mixture of anticipation and lingering weakness swirling within her. Her heart leaped into her throat when she saw Alexander appear in the hallway, Leo in his arms. The little boy, now 8 months old, seeing his mother, immediately reached out his small arms, a look of pure joy on his face. "Mama!" he cried out clearly, a new word he had learned during her absence. Tears instantly sprang to Isabella's eyes. She pushed herself up from the wheelchair despite the nurse's protests and hugged her son, holding him close, her body still weakened but filled with a strength born of love and reunion. Alexander watched them, a warm smile in his eyes, warmer than they had ever been. "Let's go home," he said simply, and that word home resonated differently this time. To Isabella's surprise, the car didn't turn towards her small apartment building. Instead, it drove towards the familiar, exclusive neighborhood of the Sterling mansion. I thought you'd take me to my place," she commented, confused. "The doctor said you need care and rest for the next few weeks," Alexander replied, his gaze steady. "At the mansion, you'll have help 24 hours a day. I've prepared a room for you and Leo." Isabella wanted to protest, to say she could manage, that she could go back to her apartment, to her life. But the truth was, she still felt weak. And more importantly, the idea of being close to Alexander, of continuing to see him interact with Leo, of building on the connection they had found. It filled her with a warmth she didn't want to abandon. Upon arriving at the mansion, she discovered that a room was in fact a complete suite adjacent to Alexander's main bedroom. It was perfectly equipped with everything she and Leo could possibly need: a new crib, age-appropriate toys, clothes, even a state-of-the-art baby monitor. "I don't know how to thank you for all this," Isabella said that night after tucking Leo into his new crib. They were sitting on the small balcony of the suite, sharing a cup of tea under the night sky. "You've done more than anyone ever has." "I didn't do it out of obligation, Isabella," Alexander responded, his voice softer than usual. "You and Leo, you've given me something I thought was lost forever." The following days settled into a new normal. Isabella was no longer simply the housekeeper. She occupied an ambiguous space in the house and in Alexander's life, something more than an employee, less than a partner, yet undeniably present. The staff watched with polite curiosity, not daring to comment openly, but noticing how their boss now ate breakfast every morning with Isabella and the baby, how he played with Leo in the garden every afternoon, how his evening conversations with Isabella on the balcony stretched late into the night. A week after her return, while having dinner together in the main dining room, something unthinkable just months ago, Alexander asked a question that had been on his mind. "Have you thought about what you'll do when you're fully recovered, Isabella?" Mariana left her fork on the plate, feeling a sudden knot in her stomach. She hadn't wanted to think about it, about the inevitable moment she would have to return to her reality, to her small apartment, to her job, potentially losing this fragile connection. "I suppose I'll go back to my apartment," she replied cautiously, her voice quiet, and come back to work here if you still need me as a housekeeper." Alexander looked at her intently, choosing his next words with care. I do need you, Isabella. He paused, his gaze unwavering. But I need you for something more than just cleaning this house. Isabella's heart began to pound. What exactly was he suggesting? The vast difference in their worlds, in their statuses, hung heavy in the air. Alexander, these past few months, he interrupted, his voice gaining a quiet intensity. Caring for Leo, seeing you. They've been the happiest I've had in years. You've shown me everything I was avoiding. He rose from his chair and walked towards her, kneeling beside her seat so he could be at her level. He took her hands in his, and Isabella could feel a slight tremor in them, a vulnerability she hadn't often seen. Caring for your son. It made me understand what I lost, he confessed, his voice barely a whisper, filled with a raw emotion that tore at her heart. And what I still deeply desire. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a profound truth. A family, Isabella. A life that isn't just work and solitude. Isabella felt tears threatening to spill. It was too perfect, too sudden, too intense. We're from such different worlds, Alexander, she whispered, voicing the fear that had been present since the beginning. You're Alexander Sterling, and I'm just the girl who cleans your house. You're the woman who taught me how to open my heart again, he responded firmly, his grip on her hands tightening gently. The mother of a wonderful boy who allowed me to heal wounds I thought were eternal. I don't care what world you come from, Isabella, only that you want to be a part of mine, a part of us. Part 13. Living as a Family and Confession. Part 14. A New Life Grows. Life settled into a surprising, beautiful rhythm at the Sterling mansion. Isabella and Alexander, along with Leo, had become a family. Isabella continued her part-time work at the shelter, staying connected to the community that had supported her. But her life was now centered around the mansion, around Alexander, around Leo. Alexander balanced his demanding career with being a present, loving father and partner. They spent their days together, their evenings together, their weekends together, a unit built on shared vulnerability, earned trust, and a love that had bloomed in the most unexpected circumstances. The professional boundaries had dissolved entirely, replaced by the effortless intimacy of two people deeply committed to each other and the child they shared. Isabella saw the man behind the CEO, kind, patient, capable of immense love. Alexander saw the woman behind the single mother, resilient, compassionate, and the source of a warmth that had melted the ice around his heart. Their relationship wasn't conventional, but it was real. They navigated the curious glances of staff and the whispers of society with a quiet confidence, their focus firmly on the life they were creating within the walls of their home. Alexander's face seemed permanently softer now, the sharp lines of stress eased, replaced by a quiet contentment. One evening, sitting on the balcony after putting Leo to bed, the city lights twinkling below, Alexander took Isabella's hand. Isabella, he said, his voice low, filled with emotion. These past few months, living here with you and Leo, it's the happiest I've had in a very long time. Isabella squeezed his hand, her heart full. Me too, Alexander. He turned to her, his gaze intense, searching. You and Leo, you didn't just bring light back into this house, Isabella. You brought it back into my life. He confessed, his voice raw with vulnerability, acknowledging the pain he had carried for so long. After I lost my son, and then my wife, I thought I would never feel anything but emptiness again. I built walls so high, I thought nothing could ever get through. Isabella reached out, gently touching his cheek. We didn't try to break them down, Alexander. He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. No, you just walked around them. You and Leo. You made them unnecessary. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, thick with emotion. I love you, Isabella. I love you more than I thought I was capable of loving again. Isabella reciprocated, acknowledging his transformation and her love. They shared a deep, loving kiss, no longer just employer/employee, but two people bound by a love that had overcome immense obstacles. Weeks later, Isabella started feeling it, the familiar wave of dizziness, the overwhelming fatigue, the morning sickness she couldn't ignore. She knew the symptoms. She had experienced them before years ago when she was pregnant with Leo. A frantic trip to the pharmacy confirmed her suspicion. Positive. A baby. Their baby. A child with Alexander. The initial wave of overwhelming joy was quickly followed by anxiety. Alexander's history with fatherhood was marked by profound trauma. He had lost his first son, a loss that had frozen his heart for years. Was he ready to face the possibility of fatherhood again, knowing the pain of loss? Would the fear of reliving that trauma be too much? For days, Isabella kept the secret, watching Alexander with Leo, seeing the loving father he had become, trying to find the right moment to share the news, praying his past fear wouldn't overshadow their future. Finally, one night after putting Leo to bed, Isabella found Alexander in his study, reviewing documents. She walked in slowly, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "We can talk?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Alexander looked up immediately, his gaze sharp with concern, noticing her nervousness. "What is it, Isabella? Is everything okay? Is Leo all right?" He stood, coming towards her, taking her hands. "Whatever it is, we can face it together." Isabella took a deep breath, searching his eyes for any sign of his past pain, finding only love and concern. "There's something I need to tell you, Alexander," she began, sitting down, pulling him gently with her. "Something important." "You're scaring me, Isabella," he said, his thumb stroking her hand. I'm pregnant," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, watching his face intently for his reaction. "We're going to have a baby." Alexander's face froze. The shock was immediate. For a terrible moment, Isabella feared the worst, feared the shadow of his past grief would overwhelm him. He pulled his hands back slightly, shaking his head as if to clear it. "Alexander?" she whispered, reaching out to him, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. He looked up, and the terrified look in his eyes from that moment on the shelter floor, when he realized Leo was his, was briefly back. He put a hand to his face, visibly affected, struggling with the news. "The last time," he whispered, his voice broken, raw with the memory of loss. "The last time." Isabella felt a knot of fear tighten in her throat, but she reached for him, placing her hand gently over his, her voice soft but firm, filled with the strength she had found in their love. "This time will be different, Alexander," she said. "This time, we're together. We'll do this together." Alexander closed his eyes for a brief instant, breathing deeply, letting her words, her presence, anchor him. When he opened them again, the fear was still there, the memory of loss, but something else had joined it. Hope. Immense, overwhelming joy. "A baby?" he whispered, as if fearing saying it aloud would make it disappear. "You're sure?" Isabella nodded, her own eyes welling with tears of relief and happiness. "Completely sure." Alexander let out a shaky breath, and then, with a low cry, he stood and embraced her with such force he almost lifted her off the ground. He held her tight, burying his face in her hair, overwhelmed by the surge of emotion, joy, fear, profound gratitude, love. When they separated, he cupped her face in his hands, his eyes shining with tears he didn't try to hide. "I lost a son once," he said, his voice firm but thick with emotion, placing a hand gently on her still flat belly. "But I won't lose this one. This time, I'll do things right. We'll do things right." Part 15. The Future Whole Family. Years later, the Sterling mansion was no longer a symbol of cold order and solitary wealth. It was a vibrant, bustling home, filled with the sounds of children's laughter and the warmth of a family built on love, resilience, and second chances. Isabella and Alexander were married, their wedding a joyful celebration of the life they had found together. Leo, now 2.5, had officially taken the Sterling name months ago, a testament to Alexander's complete acceptance and love for the boy he proudly called his son. And just 4 months ago, their family had welcomed a new addition, Sophia, their baby daughter, a tiny bundle of joy with Alexander's clear blue eyes and Isabella's warm smile. Sitting on a bench under the wide branches of an old oak tree in the mansion gardens, Isabella watched Alexander playing with Leo, who was chasing a bright red ball with boundless toddler energy. In her arms, Sophia slept peacefully, her small face illuminated by the golden afternoon sun. "Daddy, look, I caught the ball," Leo shouted, running towards Alexander with the triumphant pride only a toddler possesses. "That's my champ," Alexander replied, scooping him up in a big hug and spinning him around, eliciting uncontrolled giggles. Isabella smiled, watching them, a quiet contentment filling her. Alexander's transformation was complete. The serious, solitary man she had known as her boss had become a loving, playful father and a tender, devoted partner. The mansion, which once seemed like a cold mausoleum, was now alive with toys, laughter, and the beautiful chaos of family. "What are you thinking about?" Alexander asked, approaching with Leo perched on his shoulders, gently lowering him beside Isabella on the bench. "Us?" she replied with a smile, leaning her head on his shoulder. "How we got here, how much has changed. Sometimes it still feels like a dream," Alexander confessed in a whisper. "After losing my first son, I built walls so high, I thought no one could ever get through. I was sure family love wasn't meant for me. And we didn't even try to tear them down," she responded, smiling, remembering the moment in the hallway. "We just walked around them." Alexander laughed softly, kissing her neck. "You and Leo, you didn't just walk around my walls. You made them unnecessary. Life hadn't been without its challenges." They had to navigate the curious and sometimes malicious stares of the high society where Alexander moved, the veiled comments about the former housekeeper who had caught the millionaire. Mrs. Rodriguez had sometimes recounted how some of Alexander's old acquaintances insinuated that Isabella was only after his money, or how the rumors about Leo not being a true sterling circulated in thinly disguised whispers. But Alexander had surprised everyone, including Isabella, with his absolute indifference to these opinions. The man who had once been so concerned with appearances and his company's reputation now made it crystal clear that his family, his happiness, came above all else. He had reduced his work hours, delegated responsibilities, and reorganized his life to be present for every important moment. First steps, first words, every scraped knee, every school play. "Remember the day we met?" Isabella asked suddenly, a warm smile on her face. "When you found me with Leo in the kitchen, I thought you would fire me on the spot." Alexander smiled, remembering that pivotal moment that had changed the course of both their lives forever. "In that moment, Isabella, I only saw an inconvenience," he admitted, his voice soft with the weight of hindsight. "I had no idea I was looking at my salvation, at my entire future." Sophia stirred in Isabella's arms, opening her clear blue eyes and looking around with that expression of wonder only babies possess. Alexander extended a finger, and the little girl grasped it with surprising strength. "I think we saved each other," Isabella said softly, her gaze meeting Alexander's, filled with deep love. "You gave us a home, security, belonging, and we reminded you how to love again, how to be a father." Leo returned running, this time holding a small flower plucked from the garden, which he offered proudly to his mother. Alexander scooped him up into his lap, completing the family portrait. Life had taken unexpected turns for both of them. Pain, loss, and loneliness had marked them deeply, but they had also prepared them to recognize and cherish happiness when they finally found it in the most improbable place, between a distant employer and his housekeeper, between a man who feared loving again and a woman who just wanted a safe future for her son. As the sun began to set on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Alexander looked at his family. Leo nestled against his chest, Sophia sleeping peacefully in Isabella's arms, and Isabella herself, her face radiant with love and peace. He realized a simple yet profound truth. This was the life he never knew he wanted, but now he couldn't imagine living without it. United by the love that had blossomed from the ashes of their painful pasts, the family they never expected to form contemplated the sunset, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, and above all, a love that would continue to grow with every shared day. Part 16, Epilogue. 2 years had passed since that transformative afternoon in the hospital. The house that once seemed too large for one man and his regret now felt almost too small for a family of 4 running through its halls. Isabella was no longer the housekeeper. She had accepted a position at the city's children's hospital, allowing her to balance her career as a pediatrician with the beautiful chaos of motherhood. Alexander had reorganized the Sterling Group, delegating more, working from home often, ensuring he was present for every scraped knee, every milestone, every bedtime story. "Leo, put that down," Isabella called out, chasing their 2-year-old son who had gotten into a box of antique photographs. "How many times do I have to tell you not to touch things on the shelves?" The little boy looked up with those eyes so like Alexander's, a perfect blend of innocence and mischief. "Sorry, Mama," he mumbled, wrapping his arms around her legs in a move he knew always melted her heart. "Where's Daddy?" he asked, looking around. "He's in the kitchen, champion," Alexander's voice called out. "Getting breakfast ready." Isabella followed Leo into the kitchen, finding a scene that had become familiar, one that never failed to fill her with warmth. Alexander, apron over his dress shirt, was making scrambled eggs while Leo, perched on a special stool, carefully placed rebanadas to pan slices of toast onto 3 plates. "Good morning," Alexander said, stealing a quick kiss as she passed him. "Coffee is ready." "Thanks," Isabella replied, pouring herself a cup. "Did you remember you're leaving early today for Leo's pediatrician appointment?" "All under control. I'll leave at 3, pick up Leo from daycare, and then we'll head straight to the doctor's." "Perfect. I'll make sure the bag is ready." Isabella nodded, sipping her coffee. Her days were still busy, balancing consultations at the hospital with their family life, but it was a fulfilling busyness. The morning routine continued: breakfast together, the inevitable, joyful battle of getting Leo dressed, teeth brushed, and finally, everyone piling into the car to start their day. "Your turn to drop him off today," Alexander reminded her, adjusting his tie while Isabella secured Leo in his special car seat. "I know." She leaned over and kissed Alexander goodbye. "See you tonight?" "Count on it," he replied, his eyes filled with love before heading to his own car. As she drove towards Leo's daycare, Isabella thought about how much her life had changed. She was no longer the pediatrician who planned every detail. She lived in organized chaos now, with toys dispersed through the living room, schedules that changed constantly, and plans that adjusted daily according to the needs of a small, energetic tyrant. And nevertheless, she had never been more happy. "Mama, can I bring my dinosaur to school?" Leo asked from the back seat. "The big one or the small one?" "The big one." "Not today, little one," she replied gently, remembering the daycare rules. The immediate pout that followed was brief, quickly replaced by another request. It was another lesson that Isabella had learned. The emotional storms of a child are intense but brief. Arriving at daycare, she joined the line of other mothers and fathers, faces tired but smiling, all navigating the impossible balance between their jobs, their children, and their own needs. "Have a good day, my love," she said, kissing Leo's cheek. "Be good and listen to your teacher." "Yes, I love you, Mama." Leo ran towards his classroom without looking back, confident and secure, knowing that at the end of the day, his parents would be there to pick him up. That certainty, that feeling of being loved and wanted, thought Isabella, was perhaps the greatest gift they could give him. Back in her car, she found a note tucked into the glove compartment. Alexander's handwriting. "Thanks for making this imperfect, wonderful life possible, Isabella. I love you." She smiled, tucking the note into her bag. Their love hadn't begun with fireworks or grand declarations. It had been born of duty, grown in routine, and flourished in the small, shared moments, sleepy mornings, whispered fears, first steps, and bedtime stories. It wasn't the fairy tale love of movies, but one built day by day, between bottles, sleepless nights, and first words. Isabel was right, she thought, driving towards the hospital. Sometimes, destiny takes strange paths to lead us exactly where we need to be. And sometimes, the truest love isn't the one we dream of, but the one we build together, brick by brick, moment by moment. In that slightly chaotic, very much loved home, with an energetic boy and a man who had learned to open his heart, Isabella had found not the ideal love, but the possible love, and it was more than enough. Has this moving story about how a father and son find their way back to each other touched you? If this narrative about family, forgiveness, and second chances touched your heart, don't forget to leave a like and share the video with those who can also find hope in this story. Your support helps us continue creating content that unites families and reminds us that it's never too late to reconnect with our loved ones. I would love to know from which country you are watching this story and if you have lived any similar experience of family reconciliation. Have you ever found yourself transforming a personal challenge into something positive, as Lucas Mateo did with his heart condition? Leave your comment below, subscribe to the channel for more stories that touch the heart, and activate the little bell so you don't miss our next publications. And that's the story of Isabella and Alexander. A journey from desperation, loss, and hidden pain to finding family, healing, and building a life filled with unexpected joy. It's a reminder that destiny works in mysterious ways, bringing us together with the people we need most when we least expect it. If this story touched your heart, made you tear up, or simply reminded you that love can heal even the deepest wounds, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and comment your favorite part below. Don't forget to subscribe to soul-stirring stories for more unforgettable tales of hope, perseverance, and finding belonging in unexpected places. Thank you for being part of our community. We'll see you in the next one for another story that touches the heart.